Fifth story. Plato's Song. Among the reeds of Meadow Pond sat Plato the frog, enduring the midday heat and the constant buzzing of the gnats. The insects had been in high spirits ever since Plato had told them a few hours earlier that he wouldn't be preying on them, at least until evening, when it got cooler. He was accustomed to feeding on fat flies, but didn't mind giving them a day off as long as they left him alone. In this heat, just the thought of shooting his sticky tongue out of his mouth was exhausting. Plato slipped into the water and relaxed. "Quack," he said contentedly, floating just under the surface of Meadow Pond. Just his head poked out of the water, and he watched opalescent dragonflies wheeling and zooming through the clear sky. With their huge compound eyes, the dragonflies could easily spot Plato, even when he was obscured by the water, so they showed off, flying aerobatics around him. At least that way they wouldn't tempt him to have a nice little snack. It's moments like these, when you should actually be feeling contented, that you realize there is something amiss. While Plato floated like a piece of wood, motionlessly pondering until he bumped into a water lily, his thoughts wandered to music. A long time ago, he had made music with 4 friends, by the pond or in glades, playing sessions which had brought them a certain amount of fame and recognition. Besides Plato the frog, the band consisted of Jonas, an otter from the north and a gifted trumpeter, Nicholas the lizard, an inspiring triangle player, Peter the badger, a master of the harmonica, and last but not least, Anya the mouse, who sang and played the accordion. Their ways had parted long ago after a heated argument, although today nobody could remember what it had been about. At the time, everyone went their separate ways and hadn't played together since. But even today, some forest dwellers remembered the small group of musicians and their sessions. Plato climbed out of the water and sat down cross-legged on top of a lily pad. He wanted to make music again. So why not pay his friends a visit this afternoon to maybe have a jam and relive the good old days? As this thought struck him, Plato sprang up, danced a couple of tap steps, spread out his arms, and exclaimed loudly, "Quack!" It already sounded like part of a song. In a high arc, the frog leapt headfirst into the water and swam back to his house on the opposite bank. A small footbridge led to the water where a rowing boat was moored. Frogs, of course, do not generally need boats, but Plato always had one ready for those guests who weren't too keen on swimming and could thus still enjoy the idyll of Meadow Pond with him. Plato opened his front door, walked down the hall, and climbed the ladder leading to his bedroom. His home clearly marked him out as a music enthusiast. His walls were covered in posters of famous musicians who'd been at their peak decades ago and since fallen into obscurity. Great entertainers from a time when the streets of the big city were filled with infectious rhythms and catchy tunes. Crab Calloway, the singing crustacean, a remarkable band leader in a white suit. The Rat Pack, who were in fact 3 very successful mice and who cracked jokes together on stage while performing their most enjoyable songs. There was a picture of Maurice Skunk, a charming French singer. Plato even owned a record player and a collection of LPs with his favourite singers. Despite the fact it was still very warm outside, the frog put on a white shirt, black trousers and braces, as he always did when going out to visit friends or family. Even in weather like this, for Plato it was out of the question not to dress in style. Finally, Plato went to the living room and opened the big doors of a huge cupboard. Carefully, he took out a case, put it on the table, and unlocked it. The case contained Plato's violin, its polished red wood gleaming in the sunlight. He ran his hand over the precious instrument before closing the case and snapping the locks shut. Then the frog left to visit the friends he had lost sight of so long ago. As Plato didn't like walking along gritty paths with his thin-skinned feet, which were more suited to swimming and the living room, he decided to take his bike. He strapped his violin case onto the rack and started pedalling. First on the list to visit was Peter. As far as Plato knew, the badger now owned a bakery and sold pastries on the western outskirts of the forest. The quality of his bread was beyond question, with many customers happily confirming the fact every Sunday when he baked his famous Sunday rolls. Plato rode along the bank of the pond, then turned onto the track that led around Mousewood. The direct route through the forest was shorter, but by bike he'd be quicker if he rode outside the woods. En route, he came across two humans, who watched the frog pass by with astonishment. "Look, a frog," said one to the other. "They live in ponds and pools and eat insects, I think." Soon the frog reached the western edge of Mousewood, where he got off and pushed his bike along the path, since he wasn't familiar with this part of the woods and didn't know exactly where to find his old friend. In front of a row of houses, two grandfatherly squirrels were telling stories of the old days, with a cluster of grand and great-grandchildren playing and laughing around them. When they saw the frog with his bicycle, the children stopped playing to get a closer look at the stranger. The seniors, however, were too busy talking to take any notice. Plato turned to them and cleared his throat. "Grandpa, I think the frog wants something," one of the kids shouted, staring at his grandfather and pointing at the frog. As he couldn't stare at Plato at the same time, the other children took that part. "Yes, what is it?" one of the elderly squirrels asked. "Excuse me," Plato began. "Could you tell me where I can find the local bakery?" "Bakery, the elderly squirrel mused. "Used to be right over there," he said, pointing to the left with his cane. "Then," he continued, "then it moved over there," and he pointed to the right. "Nowadays, though," he concluded, putting his cane back on the ground in front of him, "nowadays they're somewhere else. You'll find bread and pastries over there." Plato turned around. There indeed, with a shop window displaying the finest cakes and rolls, was the bakery. It was full of customers. "Many thanks," Plato said, and pushed his bike over the road. "That frog's got style," said one of the elderly squirrels to the other. Plato's braces obviously recalled his own youth, when the streets of the big city were filled with infectious rhythms and catchy tunes. "He reminds me of someone." The bakery was bustling with activity. The entrance or exit of every customer was faithfully marked by a tiny bell, and made no exception for our frog. Inside, the smell of freshly baked wares filled the air. Cakes and bread, but also rolls and cookies. Behind the counter, a badger attended to customer after customer. Plato wasn't sure how he should ask about Peter, and decided to join the short queue. A few minutes passed, accompanied by the bell's clear ring when the door opened or closed, and the sale of blueberry cake, cheese sandwiches, and coarse wholemeal and poppy seed bread. Eventually it was Plato's turn, and, since he wasn't an ordinary customer, he tried not to confuse the baker too much. I am an old acquaintance of Peter's. I hope this is the right place to look for him," he said. "It certainly is," the badger lady replied. "I'm his sister. I'm just helping out. He's moving in with his wife, you know. That's why he's not here right now." "I see," said Plato thoughtfully. "Unfortunately, I can't reach him at the moment either. Would you like to leave a message?" the badger lady asked helpfully. "Just send him my best wishes, please. Best wishes from Plato the frog. I'd like to make music with him again." "Plato, I've heard of you. He'll be happy to see you again," she said. "Here, have a few of our fresh cookies. On the house," she added with a twinkle. "Thanks," said Plato. "I'm sure they're delicious." An elderly mouse behind him elbowed her way to the front of the queue and said, "Yes, we all think they're delicious, so it would be most kind if you would let the rest of us buy some as well." Plato was tempted to complain about the mouse's rude manner, but then remembered he wasn't an ordinary customer. So he left the shop, and the soft ring of the bell bade him farewell. The frog picked up his bike, brooding. There were still 3 music acquaintances from the old days left to visit: Anya the mouse, Nicholas the lizard, and Jonas the otter. Plato strapped the cookies on the rack of his bike next to his violin case and rode off. "He seems somehow familiar," said the elderly squirrel with the cane as he watched the frog disappear. "You're probably confusing him, old chap," his equally elderly friend replied. "And if I am, then it's my business," said the other squirrel. He swung his cane through the air, pointed it towards the bakery, and shuffled, surprisingly quickly, across the road. Entering the shop, the squirrel had a look round. When he saw the badger lady behind the counter, he elbowed his way to the front, ignoring the numerous cries of, "How dare you! Intolerable! What appalling manners!" He wasn't that bothered. A squirrel of his age can do pretty well as he pleases. "Excuse me, but who was that sprucely dressed frog who was here a minute ago?" the old fellow asked the badger. "That was Plato, the musician," she replied. "Plato, of course!" the squirrel exclaimed, smacking his paw against his forehead, angry that this hadn't occurred to him earlier. Behind the still irritated customers, yet another person shoved their way through to the front. This time it was Peter the baker, carrying a large box and wheezing, "Plato the frog?" Plato let the cool breeze play around his green head as he rode past fields and meadows and a group of mice and squirrels on a hiking trip. Eventually he reached an avenue of old trees offering much-needed shade. The frog dismounted and had a look round. Jonas the otter lived near the avenue, close to a small stream, so Plato left his bike at the track and walked down a narrow path leading to his friend's house. There he knocked on the front door. No one answered. There was no one home. Disappointed by his run of bad luck, Plato strolled back up to the avenue and decided to take a break from his roaming around. At that moment, a gentle melody wafted down to him. It was a robin, high in the treetops, and its song was so lovely, Plato stopped to listen. A few minutes later, the robin had finished and took off from the green canopy into the clear blue sky. But Plato was oblivious, having fallen asleep. While he was sleeping, Plato's dreams took him far, far away, as far as one can be taken by one's dreams. Yet, for a moment, he thought he heard 2 old squirrels, a badger, and other animals walking through the forest, chatting. But so many dreamlike things happened in his dreams that the voices almost immediately slipped away again, and sleep had him back in its cosy arms at the edge of the forest. When Plato awoke, the sun had almost disappeared beyond the horizon, taking the warmth of the day with it and leaving sky and clouds to shine in the afterglow. Back on his feet, the frog took a few moments to grasp where he actually was. "I must have fallen asleep," he thought. "No wonder in this heat." Now, though, he was wide awake and well rested, and it was a really lovely evening. But now he could hardly visit his acquaintances, being reluctant to disturb people after sunset, and even more so uninvited. So Plato made his way back to Meadow Pond without having jammed with a single one of his friends. He sighed and reached for the cookie bag strapped to his bike rack. He took a cookie, and then another. Delicious, he thought, eating some more. When the bag was empty, he crumpled it up, put it in his pocket, and brushed the crumbs off his shirt. Then he switched on his bike lights and rode home. Night had not yet fallen when Plato reached Meadow Pond, but it was dusky enough to spot the fireflies as they sped through the reeds and tall grass in front of his house. Wanting to walk the rest of the way, Plato got off his bike, when suddenly someone leapt out of the bushes. "The frog! It's the frog!" shouted a little squirrel, pointing at Plato and scurrying off towards Meadow Pond. Plato was quite startled. Slowly he pushed his bike onwards, the sand crunching beneath its wheels. "We wondered when you'd turn up," shouted Peter the Badger, waving to him. With him were Anya, Nicholas and Jonas, all the musicians he used to play with so many years ago. There were also the grandfather squirrels, their grandchildren, and several other forest dwellers. They had decorated the footbridge to Plato's house with lanterns, and all of them were in a merry mood. The elderly squirrel he had talked to outside the bakery came up and said, "I always admired your music, you know. When I heard you wanted to play again, I gathered your former colleagues together and then waited for you right here. It seems you have quite a few fans," he said, pointing out the guests who raised their glasses of blue juice in greeting. Some of them Plato recognized as customers of the bakery. "Well then," said the frog, opening his case and taking out the instrument. The guests held their breath in anticipation. They were so quiet they could hear the soft sound of Plato picking up his violin and bow. Plato walked down to the footbridge, where his fellow musicians were already assembled. All four greeted Plato as if it had been yesterday when they last made music together. And then they were set. Anya the mouse picked up her accordion. Nicholas the lizard had his triangle at the ready, a bit nervous about playing in front of an audience again. Jonas the otter fiddled with the mouthpiece of his trumpet, calm as could be, and Peter took his harmonica out of his front pocket. "Why don't we start with Plato's song?" Anya suggested. The other musicians agreed, and Plato felt honoured, since he had composed Plato's song, one of their most famous pieces, back in their heyday. The band started to play, and their music sounded just like in the old days. The audience were enthusiastic, and more animals from the neighbourhood came to listen to the infectious rhythms. Even the toad family swam over from the opposite side of Meadow Pond and joined in. As the song ended, the frog danced a couple of tap steps on the footbridge where the boat for guests had been tied up, spread his arms wide, and, to applause from the audience, said loudly, "Quack!" And that's how Plato's song ends.